Hello and welcome to episode 232 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are talking about people talking, I think, is probably the best way to put it. Daniel Tsay, he appeared on the flank probably about a week ago now, but we are now going to discuss it. We couldn't do it when we were talking about the minor, but we feel like this is probably going to be a long conversation because he touched on a lot of topics that are pretty important and a lot of topics that we've previously discussed and hoped that somebody in the CDL would notice and, hopefully do something about it. I don't know if that'll come of this, but I do think that some of those things were pretty interesting that he said. And then we also have the second week of the Major 2 qualifiers coming up, so we'll give our predictions for that. And before we get to any of that, though, how are you doing, Mink?
Yeah, doing all right. Like you said, I think this should be a decent filler episode, for lack of a better descriptor, because if we weren't talking about this flank stuff, all else we would have is just previewing the upcoming week of matches, and we'd be out of here in like 10-15 minutes. So I think this is a good time and a good opportunity to sort of dive into everything that went down on that last flank episode, or the recent flank episode, and should give us some good stuff to talk about, hopefully.
Let's start with the winner's bracket conversation because this has been something, especially this year, that has really grabbed hold of the CDL. I think in large part because OpTic was the winner's bracket team in both Major 1 and Major 2, and then they went on to lose both of those grand finals. And but like we should say, like, this conversation's been happening for years and years, because previously, before the CDL, the way that most tournaments did their grand finals was the winner's bracket team had to win one best of five out of two, essentially. The loser's bracket team had to win two separate best of fives back to back to essentially reset the bracket and win the tournament. And the CDL has not done that. That has not been something that they have seemed willing to do. They have pretty much just went with a best of seven, and there's no advantage for the winner's bracket team, at least on the surface. And this was, of course, a topic that came up during the flank conversation. And Daniel Tsay, I said it in the pre-show, I have a hard time changing the way I say his last name because we were saying Daniel Tsay for like 3 years. But Daniel Tsay, he said that it was essentially too far. That a winner, that a bracket reset would be too far of a move for the CDL to do, and that they actually quite like the current setup that they have, and that was pretty clear by the stat that he put out. What was that, like a month and a half ago? I think maybe after Major 1, where it was like 55% of the winners bracket teams, they win the majors, and 45% of the losers bracket team win the majors. And he said that was a pretty good thing. Obviously, that's not what I think a lot of people think. But what did you think of his kind of views and his explanation for why the CDL has been so reluctant to go to a bracket reset or some other kind of winner's bracket advantage at their majors?
I think it was sort of, similar to the point that he had made previously, in the sense of echoing that it's not necessarily, in this being in terms of the bracket reset, isn't something you see in traditional sports, which, I mean, that's a whole different conversation, really, just because it's another instance of trying to draw parallels between the real sports and esports. But um, that's really what it seems like it comes down to in terms of the bracket reset from an outside perspective, is it not being something that's typically seen in traditional sports. It's not. Then there's like that whole stat behind like the winners bracket team versus the losers bracket team, and how frequently they win, yada yada, all that. um I really thought that the most interesting part of this conversation, though, was talking about the potential for other formats that could come down the line, and obviously this wasn't anything where it was like, oh, we're looking at this, or this is going to happen right now. But um the one that stood out to me the most was mentioning giving that winners bracket team a 1-0 lead, but it was discussed as a best of 7 and not a best of 9. And I think that is very dangerous territory, because I feel like that's, if you're giving them a best of 7 with a 1 map advantage, they basically just have to win a best of 5 at that point in order to win
Yeah.
the championship, and there's no real difference between any other series in the grand finals at that point, at least. So I am not a fan of that idea. Obviously, I think 1-0 series lead for a best of 9, I think that could work because it is more maps and all that. Um, I did think the idea of taking all vetoes away from the losers bracket team or giving the winners bracket team all of the vetoes, that could be an interesting concept.
Hmm.
I don't know how much I really like that. I do think that certainly makes it more of an advantage than it currently is right now. And potentially that could be the fairest way, because I've said before when we've talked about this, I'm not a huge fan of just giving a team a free map entirely, even if they've earned that. Um, so yeah, I did think, it doesn't sound like there's anything set in stone, or anything that's, certainly coming down the pipeline in terms of changing the winners bracket advantage, or how the grand finals look, or anything like that. But it's at least it's a conversation that's being had behind the scenes. That's one thing you can take away from this, is they're talking at least, and that's a good thing in itself. Um, whether it leads to change or not is another, topic entirely. But they are having those conversations, clearly, based on what we've heard here. And it'll just be a matter of what the next steps look like in acting upon this.
Yeah, I don't know about the vetoes. Like, obviously, that's a big change, and that would be pretty radical because we haven't really seen anything like that in like pre CDL or in the CDL. The only not the only issue, I guess, but one of the issues is that the longer a series goes, if you have like a best of 7 or best of 9, the vetoes mean significantly less in those series than they do in a best of 5, of course, because then you have like a lot more control over how the maps are, or like which maps are played and all of that. So that is a downside to doing it in the grand finals. But of course, that's like, a relatively small downside. The 1-0 is interesting. Obviously, like I proposed, if you've played before, like it just is a continuation series, but you would play a very large series. Like, how many maps do we have currently? We have like 6, 6, and 3, right? We have
Yes, that sounds
15.
right.
So I think a best of 15 would be pretty interesting, but just a continuation, so you don't replay the maps that you played in your previous match, if you've played, obviously. So like that could be a way to go. I think, and I've said this before when we had like a longer conversation previously, when we say that there isn't a winner's bracket advantage, that is true on its face, but that's not how the CDL obviously sees it. They see not having to play in the loser's bracket and not being at risk of elimination in the loser's bracket. They see that as an inherent advantage. And I think that's kind of what they get at a lot, is that they don't like just having to play one more is how they view kind of like I was gonna make up a really stupid word, but basically punishing the team that got knocked down to the loser's bracket. But obviously, that's not the case for a lot of teams. In fact, it probably helps some teams because they get the momentum, they get warm on Sunday, and they get some, they basically get the confidence back after losing that match, and then they roll right into the grand finals. And we have what we've had the last 2 majors, where OpTic despite absolutely cruising through the winners bracket. They lost one map between two tournaments in the winners bracket. They lose both grand finals, and in that second grand finals against FaZe, they kind of got smoked. Like it was what 4-1 or something like that. So like it wasn't relatively close. And so I do get why there are people calling for some kind of change if the winners bracket teams are winning less and less. And, maybe it's this year is just an anomaly that this, like, we might have another losers bracket team win in Major 3, but we might have like three winners bracket teams win next year at the majors. So it could balance itself out. We I think it was like 53-47 or something like that, after Major 2 in terms of the winner bracket and loser bracket split. So I don't know, like it's not a mistake by them. Like it's an intended thing. Like they want it to be 50-50. They don't want it to be like a 70-30 split. They don't want people to essentially have like a massive advantage, or the viewers to be like, of course, like OpTic's going to win because they have like this massive advantage. They don't want that. And I think we're probably just going to have to like come to accept that. I don't really even like, I know they said they're discussing some of these changes. I don't think that they're going to change anything. I don't think that they're like incentivized to actually like radically shift what they've been doing, because what they're doing right now is the intended outcome. And I think that's important to note, with all of this talk about the changes and whatnot. Any other issue or any other topic that you want to touch on the winners bracket part of it?
I think you kind of offhanded mentioned like warming up or whatever, and I thought that was one of the more interesting conversations at the start of this episode of the flank. Was they got right into that whole debacle from Major 2 where OpTic weren't allowed to have the Huntsmen warm up OpTic while they were waiting to play in the grand finals of Major 2. And according to Daniel, it was really just an issue with getting those four players credentialed uh, before Sunday started and everything. And he mentioned like um which I actually agree with this now that I heard him say it, in the sense of like when that was actually he apparently the disconnect right now is it's in terms of when this communication was happening between OpTic and the league, because Methods was claiming that they tried to request this to go through the day before, and Daniel was insinuating that that wasn't the case. But nevertheless, he was basically saying that like if they allowed OpTic to get those guys like in there and stuff at that time, it would have been like possibly when a team had already been eliminated on Sunday, and then like not every team on Sunday would have had that same opportunity uh to have somebody warm them up as OpTic would have had. So um I think at least it was good to hear that it wasn't, you know, any like strange reason or anything. Like when we talked about this before, we were like, you know, this should be something that OpTic is rewarded for having a challengers team. And it's not, it doesn't sound like it was anything like that where they were just like, no, you can't get those guys in, or something like that. It really was like a security thing. He mentioned like breaking down the setups, I believe, of like the teams that leave and not having room and all this yada yada. End of the day, though, he said basically like they said essentially for Major 3, this is going to be um, a new process where any team on Sunday can get four guys and get them like set up to be available to scrim them beforehand, and that I'm hoping that works out, because that could be a very big, I don't want to say advantage here, but for lack of a better term, it could be a very helpful thing in terms of this grand finals conversation as a whole, because there's just a big difference from playing 2v2s with yourself or shooting bots versus actually scrimming like a legit team. And then you get into the conversation of which team do these guys, like for OpTic can get the Huntsman. If you have a team like, I'll just use Cloud9, if Cloud9 somehow is ever in a championship Sunday, who are they getting to warm them up because they don't have a challengers team or something like that? And then you get into these situations with like, are you able to get a really good challengers team, or are you just getting four random people and getting a pickup squad together? Which I would still argue even a pickup squad, playing 4v4s with your actual team is more beneficial than bots or 2v2s or playing with coaches, whatever teams have been currently doing. So I think that kind of ties into this grand finals thing, and that could be something interesting to keep an eye on at Major 3, because if this does actually work the way it's intended, that could help the winners bracket team be more prepared for the finals, and in turn lead to the winners bracket team winning more often, despite like the format potentially not changing.
And then the CDL is like, all right, we're getting rid of these scrim teams because you're screwing up the mojo here. Like, we were going 50-50, and now we're back to 65-35, and we need to get rid of that. So I think it's interesting. I don't, like, obviously the specifics of it are probably the most important part, like in terms of Major 2 and why it happened the way it happened. I honestly, I had never thought about this before because I just assumed that like a team could get like a, four guys in there to scrim, and like, especially because a lot of players are friends, and like whether it's fellow CDL players or whether it's challengers players, like I just assumed that they'd be able to have somebody to scrim. That just seemed like logical to me. I'm glad that it's happening for Major 3. I hope there are no issues. It just is a very weird situation all around. But I want to shift the focus because you mentioned challengers, and this was a topic of conversation that came up with Daniel as well. And he said that they had a 3 to 4 hour meeting last year with players and all of that at the Madrid Major. And he said like half the time during that meeting, it was just Ghosty advocating for improvements in challengers, which I couldn't be any more of a Ghosty fan anyway. But like this helps his stock tremendously, and I think with challengers, it has seemed like less of a focus every year essentially. Like it felt like maybe at the beginning, because it was a new thing and it wasn't like amateurs and pros, like there before there was like a very like soft line of demarcation. It was like some teams, like if you get top 16 then you're a pro and you're no longer an amateur or whatever, like even though that's not really how it works. Challengers, obviously there's a line. If you're not within the 12 teams in the CDL, you're a challengers player. And it seems like from 2020 to now 2026, the focus on challengers has diminished quite a bit, to the point that I think a lot of people don't know about the challengers players until they get called up to the CDL or are playing like with like current CDL players. Like it doesn't feel like they are well known nearly as at all, because they don't play CDL players like in the matches, like Friday through Sunday. Before, you might actually see like Team Revenge very famously went to Champs Grand Finals, and those four guys essentially became overnight names. They became people to be known in the CDL or in in the COD community. That doesn't happen anymore unless you're like Mercules, who gets called up like on a weekend, and it's like I have to like make the most of this. But other than that, like we don't really get to see that. What did you think of his conversation and his comments on the challenger scene as a whole?
I think in terms of that whole like ghosty conversation, I mean that was just a huge shout out ghosty moment. Like that was really really cool to hear. There was another moment earlier in the show, during that winners bracket segment too, where they had some sort of like feedback request from all the teams before Major 2, and he said not everybody joined that call, and it seemed like that was another instance of him alluding to something along the lines of that in that feedback meeting in Madrid he was talking about. It seems like it's another case. They were talking about it At another time too, maybe it was around the maps or something like that. But there were instances throughout this conversation where it sounded like something that we've also alluded to is that the league has been trying to have these conversations with teams, players, etc., and not everyone always responds, or not everyone is always willing to participate in feedback sessions or whatever the case may be. So that is something uh we do have to keep in mind as often as you, myself, the community, and anybody is negative towards the league, and it's the perception of it, like, you know what it's trying to do and all that. Like, it's a two-way street, and if the league, obviously Daniel's not going to come on the flank and be like, oh yeah, the league's not doing anything, or not trying to uh reach out or talk to anybody like that. He's obviously not going to say that. But um if it's not being reciprocated, and nobody is not everybody is trying to also communicate with the league and everything like that, that can be an issue, and it's in and of itself. So that's something to keep in mind here too, with that whole section, I would say. But in terms of the challenger stuff, I mean, he was in the call with methods and Zuma, obviously, and obviously the Huntsman is a newer thing this year, bringing that back. But Zuma's been doing the Stallions for a while now. They mentioned Bush. So they had a decent conversation around challengers, and sort of like, I'm pretty sure at one point the word Daniel used was like a resurgence for challengers, and that's really how it's felt um to me this year. Was like, and obviously I think that's partially because of the Bush, and because of that, like, barstool feel to having this new group trying to do something in COD esports. But even regardless of who it was, I think it's pretty safe to say that there's been more interest in Challengers Call of Duty this year than probably any other year in the CDL for a while now. Maybe like the first year of the CDL, there was, you could argue there was a lot of interest, because there was just, that was the first year of this league, and
Mm-hmm.
that's when we were having the conversations of every team should have a farm system like baseball, or a minor league team, whatever. Um, Things have certainly changed over the years since then,
Yeah.
but it was cool to hear that conversation. And um, I think it sort of bled over into the topic of expansion, which is something we've always talked about a lot. And the very basic approach that Daniel said was like, he threw out the number of 16 as being the ideal number for teams in the CDL, which is something I have been very vocal about
Yeah.
in terms of working from a bracket perspective, and it's just a nice round number. But he also said that the, like, sustainability, what were some of the other words he was using? Sustainability was a lot. Financial sustainability, I think, and stability too. Those were the words being thrown around, and he was basically saying um, like, it'd be cool if they could get the 16 teams, but they want to make sure that the 12 teams that we have now are sustainable. And this is when they were kind of talking about some of those other bottom teams that,
Yeah.
don't have uh, seemingly the best intentions, or maybe that's not the right way of saying it, but these teams that are at the bottom and just doing the
Broke
bare
boys.
minimum to skate by,
Yeah.
and just exist in the league and stuff like that. So, that's at least on the radar. It doesn't sound like, until we get like 12 reliable and sustainable teams, there probably won't be expansion. It was my takeaway from that. Um, but that also, you know, could mean that challengers will be even more important going forward, if that is to be the takeaway from that section. Because it's like, okay, if you're not going to be one of those challengers teams that's vying for one of those 12 spots potentially to like try and, replace somebody currently in the league. How much longer are you gonna wait around and hang around and wait to see if something changes on that front and all that stuff? So it's gonna be interesting.
All right, so I call absolute bullshit on Daniel and his sustainability argument. Like, I think that is just a ridiculous claim to make in light of the Carolina Royal Ravens having Saint be the coach, GM, and social media manager for one of the dozen CDL teams. Like, that's ridiculous. Boston laid off all of their people years ago. How is that financially stable, right? Like, their entire Oxygen Esports team basically got wiped off the map like over a weekend. The Guard, which formerly owned Los Angeles Guerrillas, they laid off their entire staff and they stayed in the CDL for like another 2 years after that. Granted, like you can argue that General Mates was running the show last year and that it was like a compromise, which didn't make any sense because like to be honest, like to think about like they changed the name from LAG to LAG Mate and then change it to General Mates, like it never made any sense, like why they couldn't just go to at least like it didn't make it, like, let's just be real about that. Like that didn't make any sense. The Vancouver Surge, the rumor is that they are in debt for like $6-7 million, right? Like that was the figure that was being thrown around. Every year in between CDL seasons, there is at least one team that either rebrands, relocates, or changes ownership. And sometimes all three, and sometimes multiple teams that do that. I could get the argument that yes, like you want OpTic and you have stable franchises relatively in like OpTic and FaZe and LAT, and Toronto seems to be very very committed to the CDL cause, and Miami seems very committed, and blah blah blah. Like there are teams that I don't want to say like nobody is committed and nobody's stable and nobody's sustainable or whatever. But like give me a break that like the reason that it hasn't grown at all is like stability and sustainability. Like the only reason that it wouldn't have happened, especially with no entrance fees and like all this stuff about like how much you have to pay to get into the CDL, like the biggest reason I could think of is the teams don't want to share the like very, very small pot that they already share from like media rights deals or whatever, like whatever revenue that they're generating and goes to them rather than the CDL. Obviously, if that expands to 16 teams, then they'd have to split it up differently, or there'd have to be some agreement between the expansion teams, as is the case with traditional sports, and like they take less of the money to start, so like they basically are paying their way into the league, and the other teams in the league feel like an incentive financially to bring them in. But like I just like absolutely call fucking bullshit on that. Like we have like a quarter of the CDL teams that aren't competitive, that like C9, like an endemic, like high profile, like legacy esports organization is paying their guys pennies on the dollar to play for them and win like 0 matches. Like they've won like maybe 2 hardpoint maps all season long. And again, like not shitting on those guys at all. Like they were put in a really, really messed up situation. And so were the guys that started the season. Like to come in and just like be paid relatively nothing compared to your peers and expected to deliver like high level performance, like it's just ridiculous. So yeah, like he can miss me with all of that. Like I don't believe that even for 1 minute. And then it ties back to another point that I wanted to make about the Bush. Okay, like, and I agree with you. Like, it does feel like we've certainly talked more about challengers this season than we've ever talked about challengers combined over the last 5 years. But like none of that has been the doing of the CDL. You can agree with that, right?
Oh
Like
no.
Activision, Microsoft, they haven't done a goddamn thing about like bringing people's attention to challengers, like not even like one little bit. It's been all Bush. It's been all just like, and I don't want to like discount some of the other teams, like obviously Stallions and like Zuma has been great, and like OpTic with the Huntsman, like they have actually tried, but like when it gets down to it, it has been on the teams, it has been on the individuals that have like lifted up challengers and tried to help it.
Yeah.
And players like Ghosty, that's a great thing to have. Like, he's been in the CDL for multiple years, so there's like he's not really at risk of going down to challengers anytime soon. So it's not like he's looking out for his best interest necessarily. But you need those players that are in a good position to advocate for improvements in the lower level, and like the people that really need it, because the challengers, as we've seen it, is like the future of the CDL. Yes, there are some players that can bypass it entirely because they're just so talented, like they're never going to touch it. But even like someone like a Luca, who is like 19 and he broke out this year, he's still in challengers. And we saw Hydra, like a MVP world championship player, he was in challengers to start, to like obviously more probably to get his like English better and like work out with the teams and all that. But like that is what it should be used for. Like if you draft Bryce Harper number 1, like yes, he was like a literal like god basically in high school, but like he probably has to play a little bit in the minors, and like that happens from even like the traditional sports, the very best of the best. Like it is in their best interest a lot of times to play in that like minor league system to get used to it. It's kind of like a step up from like just playing with some guys, just like ragtag teams, to playing with an actual team for like a month or two, and then going to a LAN event and playing former pros and a lot of really talented up and comers. But again, none of this has been the doing of the CDL. So like, he can say all he wants about sustainability and stability. He can say all that he wants about the growth and like the improvements and the resurgence of challengers. But like, I can assure you that like, if he didn't lift a finger for the last 2 years, nothing would have changed.
I did think, somewhat related to what you're saying, just in terms of the problem with some organizations and stuff too. He did have a point later on saying that like they have completely removed themselves, they being the CDL, removed themselves from the equation in terms of how much teams are being paid, or how much teams are paying players.
Mm.
I thought that was interesting because the like even Methods was saying like, is there any way we can bring back the league minimum salaries, because they're basically like that would help in situations like this with the Cloud9, and then it was like, well, we know what everyone is being paid and we know what's going on, but other than that, we've completely removed ourselves from
That's good.
dealing with any of that money stuff. And I don't know how I feel about that. I do think um I don't technically know like how it works for like the like obviously I know there's a minimum in baseball. It's like 700,000
Yeah.
for when you get to the pros versus the minors. But I mean, even in like the minor leagues, I don't know if like how that works
But I think when
for
they
the
did like
people.
the minor league baseball restructuring, they had to pay them more, like the minimum
Yeah,
rised. So like, but to your point, kind of, it was like before those minor league players were like struggling. Like,
yeah,
obviously, like if you're like a number 1 pick, you're not struggling. But like, the guys that are actually probably never gonna
exactly,
make it to
yeah,
the majors, like they're on like kind of like minimum wage deals when you come down to it.
yeah. So I'm not sure how much I like the CDL being totally hands off. I think it could be really the Cloud9 situation that's making me feel this way. Like I feel like if there wasn't this like extreme outlier with Cloud9, I don't think everybody would be as up in arms about this, because we saw the league salaries earlier this year, right? Like before this the C9 change, there wasn't like anybody who was drastically below what the minimum
Yeah.
was beforehand. So it's kind of, maybe it's just something we'll have to keep an eye on going forward. But I did think that was at least somewhat interesting to hear him say like, league is handoff on the money side of things when it's as far as the money being exchanged between team and player.
I think that it's like one of the worst things that the CDO can do, actually. Like, I think being hands off with that kind of stuff leads to the Cloud9 situation, and it leads to more situations like that, because And I guess it goes back to the sustainability argument, because sustainable organizations and like stable organizations aren't going to pay their players like $20,000. Like because they understand that they're not going to be able to attract the talent and retain talent and be competitive at the same time if they're paying them like minimum wage. Like if you can make more working at McDonald's, then like you're probably not going to want to play for that CDL organization. But like that is the CDL deciding, hey, like you guys don't have to pay them. I think it was like $55,000 minimal, right? You guys don't have to pay them that. You can pay them whatever you want. I think that is one that the CDL players should have stood up at then and been like, no, like we have to like come together on this, because like, of course, Shotzi isn't affected by this. Dashy isn't affected by this. But, like, the young guys that are coming into the league, as we saw with Encourage, like, the fact that he literally went to Ben and was like, can you look over this contract? And then Ben was like, I think you should not sign this contract because you're getting paid so little and you could work a real job and make more money doing it. And then he still signed the contract because he's desperate. He wanted to be in the CDL, and understandably so. I would never blame that person or any person that does that. But the fact that the CDL is hands off leads to situations like that. And it results in, I think, what can be an abusive relationship between the teams and the players. Because the teams, as in the case of Carolina as well, they said, we're not going to pay Fire 40's buyout. So Fire has to reach in his own pocket and try to pay his own buyout from Bush so he can be in the CDL. That's just a ridiculous thing. And that leads to all of these issues. And like, it's not about the top tier players. It's about the players that are barely in the CDL or in and out of the CDL. Those guys will get taken advantage of because of this. If there's a minimum salary, then you know exactly, like there's a literal like bottom, there's a floor that you can make. So like if anybody offers you anything above that, then that's kind of gravy. But like, you know exactly going in, like at the very minimum, I'm going to get $55,000 a year for this team. Now, we're seeing it $25,000. Like, and again, like to your point, C9 seems to be like the only team that is really doing that now. But like, we can't really like verify how much the Paris Legion was paying their players, like how much they were paying those guys. And the same for like LAG, like after they signed those 3-year contracts, like who knows what the deal was at that point. And I have a problem with it from that standpoint. It's just that the CDL kind of looks away from all of this, and like what is the point of the CDL if they're not verifying like people aren't being taken advantage of, that they're verifying that like the teams are stable financially? Like why do we need the CDL? Like, wasn't this the whole point of the CDL? Like, wasn't this a selling point to get Denial Esports and Red Reserve out of the community and make sure that players aren't being taken advantage of? And yet we have like endemic esports organizations like doing the same thing or similar things to their players now. And the CDL is like, yeah, but like, we're all good here. Like, it doesn't matter. I just think that that's kind of ridiculous. And it does play back into my argument about the sustainability. It doesn't feel like they're actually, that the hands are kind of off the wheel and their eyes are kind of off the road at this point. And I think that leads to a lot of bigger issues down the pipeline. I think we could shift into, because it kind of lends itself to the stability and sustainability. Daniel claimed that the CDL has seen double-digit growth every year. And I saw a lot of people clowning him for the growth comments. I would also like to clown him for the growth comments, because I would like to see exactly in what respect is the CDL growing double digits every year. I can understand if you're saying like sometimes Major 1 to Major 2, or excuse me, Major 1 in like 2025 to Major 1 in 2026, you might see a double-digit increase in viewership. That is very understandable. I can believe that. And we can usually verify that information. But to say that the CDL is growing by double digits every year, I'm a little skeptical. What do you think about that?
The one that stood out to me more was towards the end, I believe. Yeah, it was in the like last half hour ish of the episode. Was he mentioned the 2019 playoffs was I believe the phrase he used was average minute audience, and he mentioned that was 40,000, and he says that we clear that for online matches today. So basically insinuating whatever metric that is, average minute audience, is more for an online match today than the 2019 playoffs. That seemed like very wild to me. And I don't know. Again, I think that's like the bigger thing here is that what we see and what the community see as the viewership and stuff like that is much different than the data that the league looks at and what it's telling advertisers and
Mm-hmm.
all that sort of thing. Um, so for me, that's at least like my hope is that that's where the disconnect is, and it's like they have these like much more like technical terms and
Yeah.
all that stuff that they're throwing around, and we're just us in the community, people watching are just basing our thoughts on the viewership numbers that are shown on Twitch or YouTube, and then like the post event tweets that go out about viewership and stuff. That's really all we have to base our stuff on. I would assume Daniel and the CDL and everybody has a lot more metrics and data to go on, and what that all means and everything like that, you can obviously argue, but that was the one that definitely stood out to me. Comparing an online match to the 2019 playoffs, I was just like, whoa, holy shit, that seems crazy to me. But yeah, the double digit growth thing, that also, like, I think that's at first I had to go back and listen to it again when he said that, because when I first heard it, I was like, he's saying like double, as in like times two the viewership. And then I listened to it again and it was double digit, not just double on its own. So maybe there were some people who were also confused by that in the moment and had a similar reaction to me. But at the end of the day, I don't know how that is possible. I
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, I
It
I
doesn't pass
don't
the smell test.
whatever double digit growth means, I guess it technically could be possible, because it obviously doesn't mean what I think it means when I heard that in the moment and was thinking about it after the fact, but it just doesn't seem right. But
Yeah.
then if you think about everything that's happened over these years, it technically, to some extent, the league has grown in terms of viewership in some of these cases, and then you look at those cases and it's like, well, a lot of those have to deal with when OpTic is doing well
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So there's all these outliers and everything like that. So I don't know how much stock to put into those statements there, but it was, I mean, he said it. Obviously, anybody listening to us here babbling about it, you can go back and listen to it on the flank and hear for yourself what Daniel had to say and come to your own conclusions. But I was definitely pretty confused in the moment when he was talking about that.
You said it doesn't make sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because it's not happening. There's no chance in hell that the league itself is growing double digits every year. Like, I want to make this point though. You can use a specific metric that has grown, like, or different metrics each time to say, look, in terms of average minute audience, it grew from 2021 to 2022. It was a 10% growth. And then you can say from 2023 to 2024, our merchandise numbers grew 10%. And then you can just go along the lines and say, look, everything, like, the league is growing double digits. And like but we know, we can look at these viewership numbers and we know that the popularity of the league itself is not growing double digits. The only case for it is that watch parties have skewed the numbers so bad that because OpTic and the Flank and everybody, like all these like former CDL pros and streamers and all that, like because they are involved and their viewership, like they have to be accounting for that. Because if it is just the league viewership, we can see the league viewership has obviously gone down because the watch parties are taking out a large section of the audience. So again, it doesn't pass a smell test for me. I just don't like. You're gonna have he's gonna have to actually throw like actual metrics at me, like other than just like saying we clear that from 2020 or 2019 to 2026. Like you're gonna have to actually break it down, like how the league is growing double digits every year, because I think every fan, every analyst, every pro can decidedly say that they are not like double digits, like more popular, more famous, more richer. Like none of that is actually happening. So like they're going to have to explain how that works out if they're not seeing the effects of it.
But like technically, this is where I was confused when I was thinking about it in the moment. Like technically, double-digit growth is just like plus 10, right? So like if the CDL had 100 viewers and then it's at 110, that's double-digit growth. Which I don't think that's what he means, but like that like, you know, 10 is a double-digit number, and that's the like, you know what I'm saying? Like that's what I was at the moment. I was at first thinking of it doubling, so going from 100 to 200. Then he says double digit growth, and I'm like, well, then is it 10%, like 10 plus percent growth, or is it just literally like a double digit number that is adding on to whatever they're looking at? So that's why and again, that could just be my own ignorance to how all these metrics work and stuff like that. But I was confused in the moment for sure.
Yeah, I again, like I just he's gonna have to be more specific about that for me to believe what he's saying. Because, and I'm not saying like because I think a lot of the is what it comes down to is that Scump is streaming these games, that Methods and OpTic in general are streaming these games, and Zoom is streaming these games, and like that just plays into a much larger audience. And again, that's good. And I like there were people advocating, like, you know, I think Adam Apicella, who obviously is like much more like educated on these topics and like has like an intimate knowledge of everything that's going on in the CDL and esports in general. But I believe that he's advocated, and maybe I'm wrong, so if it's not Adam, it is somebody else like in the sphere. He previously advocated for watch parties to kind of not exist because like it doesn't actually financially benefit the league, because they don't actually see the viewership, the sponsors that are paying to be like to be promoted on the CDL stream. Obviously they're seen by less or fewer people in terms of the actual CDL stream. So like I think there's an argument to be made that like the watch parties are hurtful in that regard. But I personally think that the CDL should not be chasing, you know, cents and dollars, to be honest, like at the current moment. Like what they need to do is just increase the notoriety of the CDL and get people to pay attention to the league and its players and its teams and the people within the community, because that's how you get people to spend their money to go to these events or to tune in on the stream or whatever the case may be, however you're going to make money long term. But I think that is what the CDL should be doing. And I think that's that again, like I don't want to like dismiss Daniel because he might have the metrics to back it up. But what I can say just from being in the community since 2019, at the very least, you know, obviously before that, but like you and I both know that like our like esports as a whole isn't growing double digits every year, and the CDL doesn't appear to be growing double digits every year. So like the metric he has to be using, it in my opinion is probably pretty specific, and you know more, I guess that's good for him, but I don't think that is actually indicative of what's happening in the league or what has happened in the league over the last 6 or 7 years. But yeah, the watch parties are like an actual boon to the league and to the COD community as a whole. Like, I mean, I think you watch a lot of your match or like a lot of the streams like through watch parties or like, obviously clips or whatever. And I think that's great. I think it introduces people to the CDL or competitive Call of Duty that otherwise probably wouldn't be watching those games if Scump wasn't streaming or whoever. And when we saw the watch parties go away, I think they felt that effect, when they were like, well, you have to stream on YouTube. You can't be a Twitch partner and stream our games and stuff. Like, I think that was a big mistake and they righted that wrong. They've righted the wrong of like being exclusive to YouTube and bringing Twitch back into the fold. So like a lot of these things have probably played an effect. It just doesn't like, I just can't believe the double digit part of it.
I mean, that's a pretty good point you just made at the end there in terms of bringing back Twitch and stuff. That wasn't even discussed during this episode. It's kind of just like it happened, but that was a huge deal for a while leading up to recency. Like, so that is definitely a very interesting thing to take into account here too. They definitely did talk about watch parties at some point during this episode. I remember it because I literally watched this episode less than 24 hours ago when I was writing the notes down for us, but I didn't put down in our notes here wherever they talked about the watch party, so I can't remember where that was, but I know they did talk about it, and it just must have been like a quick thing that passed by, and I didn't think it was anything worth noting down. But they definitely did talk about like watch parties existing, and Daniel definitely commented on it, saying that they like the watch parties, and I would assume it was in like that viewership area of the flank. But anybody who's interested in hearing that should definitely go check that out on their own.
They also discussed potential changes to the online portion of the CDO, which is a significant portion of the schedule, considering we have 4 majors and we have champs, and then EWC is technically not a part of the CDL season. It's a postseason tournament, but obviously like the EWC and CDL are definitely like partnered and connected and all that. But so online we had, what was it, like 5 weeks of qualifiers in Major 1, and then we had like 7, I want to say, in
I think it was 4 and 6, but yeah.
Yeah, but like we had 11 CDL online matches in the qualifiers for Major 2, which was the longest that's ever been. I think to your point that you've made previously, like competitively, it is a great thing to see everybody play the same schedule, at least in the one set of qualifiers. At the same point, though, it leads to having like 2 months straight of online matches. Sometimes those online matches really drag. You have like teams that are pretty, bad and they're not competitive, and it leads to, I think, a lot of people probably tuning out and saying like, I'll check back at the end to see how things are shaping up. Like, I don't need to see this for 2 months straight. But they talked about this particular topic, and he said that they have to find a way to make people more interested in our online weeks. But then he also said later that they hadn't discussed with the owners like changes akin to what Valorant is doing, where Valorant recently announced, as we covered a few weeks ago, that everything is a tournament. There are no like single matches. There are no like traditional sports type meetings. It is like, whether it's a 4-team tournament, whether it's 8 teams, 16, whatever, everybody is in a bracket and everybody is trying to get toward the natural conclusion, versus these online matches where it's like, it's like the Cleveland Browns versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Some people aren't going to be that interested in what's going on there. Not everything is like the Steelers and the Cowboys. So like, and that's kind of what the CDL has turned into, is like, there's just a lot. It's a slog at times to get through. What did you think of the conversation around changing the online format and what it could be moving forward?
Yeah, so this is going to tie back into what we were talking about at the beginning, actually, and this was a point I wanted to make then, but I forgot about it until just now. When they were talking about that winner's bracket advantage and the grand finals tweaks and stuff like that, and then they had this conversation later My biggest takeaway was that I think the CDL is going to use these online segments of the season to test out these different formats that could potentially be used not only in other tournaments and stuff, depending on what is used, but also could be a way of testing out what the future finals format looks like and stuff like that. Obviously not totally like one-to-one connection here, but that was just my immediate thought when I was like listening to this in the moment, was that, you know, the thing that Daniel said, and I put the quote down, was they want to find a way to make people more interested in our online weeks. And I think nobody's going to argue with that. Like that's just something that has to happen. Um, Especially as long as online play is going to remain a part of the CDL, which everybody has kind of just accepted. It is an inevitability at this point. Um, he mentioned some of the other stuff like pool play and other things they could do here and there to try and spice it up, but then said like the majors and the LAN are most likely going to stay the same. And I think, you know, trying to connect the dots, that's where my head went, was that these things of like doing the vetoes for grand finals, or maybe they do like 1 week where it's an online tournament and it's a best of 7 grand finals where the team has a 1-0 advantage, and then the next week they do a tournament, maybe not the next week, but for lack of a better example, then the next time they do a tournament where there's a bracket reset in the grand finals, and then the next time they do something with the vetoes and that sort of thing. I could see that happening as a way to not only try and spice up the online stuff, but also try to figure out what works best. And in a sense, if they did do that, that would be giving the community sort of what they want in that instance, where you're at least trying to figure out what you can do from the grand finals. And then that would, in a way, this is how I envision it happening at least. um you would get the community talking about like especially if like just using the minor tournaments as an example, if this minor this past weekend had a bracket reset, and then the next minor that comes up in a month has the 1-0 lead, which wouldn't make sense because it's a single elimination tournament, but you know what I'm getting at here.
Yeah.
If there were two different formats, then the community would be going back and forth a little bit, having that conversation. And at the end of the day, they are talking about the CDL, and the CDL would view that as a good thing, and then they're also getting feedback, blah, blah, blah. Long-winded way of saying that the CDL, at least, I don't care how you want to try and spin it here. I think this is a positive that the CDL is aware they need to do something with these online matches. What they end up doing, that is an entirely different thing, and a huge question mark around that. But they are, according to what Daniel said here, they are aware that they got to try and spice things up and try and make a difference so that these online matches just don't drag on, as you were saying.
Yeah, I think they have to make a change because the players have, like, from the very beginning of the CDL, have made it clear that they hate these matches, that they despise playing one match a week, when previously, you know, you might have like the MLG playoffs and stuff, like the Pro League, and like you'd have those matches, but you'd also have 2Ks and 5Ks that weekend, so they would get the tournaments in, and then there'd be more frequent lands than there are now. So like I just think the entire schedule for the CDL needs to be overhauled, in the sense that it shouldn't be just like one or two matches a week. I would love to see, and we made this point, or I made this point when we were talking about, you know, the Valorant, everything is a tournament, and like how that might translate to the CDL. I would love for the 2Ks and 5Ks or something similar to come back to not only give everybody like a tournament, which, to my point, really like the biggest point is like a tournament more so than online matches actually like climaxes. It actually gets to something at the very end, where the last match on like the CDL weekend can be like Carolina versus Boston, and we're all like, all right, like everybody turn off the stream right now, like nobody really needs to watch this, and there's no benefit really to watch that match other than if like you're one of you know, the 17 fans of both of those teams. But like, to be honest, that's what they should do, is go to a tournament, experiment, to your point. Like, if one week it's a tournament, one week it's like, I don't know, like some kind of setup where different teams are playing, and it just, it can't be the same thing every week. And I think that's the biggest issue. And it goes back to the points we made all along, is that like when fans are bored, then they just kind of like, I have other stuff to do. Like I don't need to be watching CDL matches for 3 days straight when none of these matches actually matter ultimately, like, or they feel like they don't matter. So I just have like a major issue with the current system. I think that the online, the 11 matches, I think that might have been the best thing that ever happened to the CDL, because it did kind of radicalize the fans of being like, I don't need to see 2 months straight of online matches. Like, please change it up. And the players feel that way, the fans feel that way, and it feels like, to your point, that the CDL is starting to feel that way too, that they have to do something else. What they do, I mean, like, they have not been very creative, I will say, in the changes that they have made to their schedule over the last 6 years. So color me a little skeptical that they're going to be, super radical with what they're doing in the 2027 season. But I think a 2K, 5K kind of setup, or something similar, and including the challengers teams, would be a big boon to that community and also the CDL as a whole. I think we should also, on that point, talk about the Pro-Ams, because that was something that was also brought up, and that it doesn't seem like we're going to get to 4 Pro-Ams in a season. It doesn't seem like every major will be a Pro-Am, but it might be more common, maybe 2 a year rather than just 1. He did mention the financial challenges that can create if they did it for all 4 majors. But yeah, I don't know. Like, to me, like, the challengers have to be part of it in some way or shape or form. I don't think like we need like 128 teams like the 2K or the 5Ks back in the day. Like, I don't think that's necessary. I don't like Jim Bob and Joe Billy. Like, they don't need to be playing Dashy and Shotzi on Sunday or whatever. Like, that's not necessary. But what I think could happen, and what I think probably should happen, is that the challengers, they can play like a tournament by themselves, and then the top 4 teams get into like the whatever, like the 5K that weekend, or like they qualify, so we have some kind of variety, and it emphasizes the challengers players, and like kind of says like, hey, like this actually matters, and like what you do on like Friday and Saturday might lead into Sunday and all that good stuff. What'd you come away with the Pro-Ams, and like what he said about the possibility of challengers being introduced into the CDL more?
I think that was probably the thing that makes the most sense. He kept talking about the Raleigh event, which I don't think that was last year. I think that was Major 1 like 2 years ago now. Um, but regardless, there's a Pro-Am coming up for Major 3, so that'll be another opportunity for this conversation to, uh, you know, be reignited a little bit, depending on how that goes and everything like that. But yeah, it was basically along the lines of like, we're not going to do 4 Pro-Ams every single year, but maybe 1 or 2 a year is possible. Definitely, he mentioned like, the financial situation around paying for all of the actual physical stages, to house like each different setup for each stream. And then one thing that did make sense that he said was he mentioned the Delta stream, and how, when there is an Alpha Bravo Charlie and Delta stream, the Delta stream just doesn't necessarily have a ton of viewers. And that makes sense to me. I feel like, at times, even in the glory days of competitive Call of Duty, you would be in situations where it was like, okay, this random match is happening on the Delta stream.
Yeah.
Like, even if you had the quad box up for multi Twitch or whatever it was at that time, like, that was generally the match that you just weren't paying the most attention to, unless the rare instances of like OpTic was on Delta. And then you would get the people complaining about OpTic being on Delta with like no commentators and stuff like that. So there's all like, people love to like say this stuff like, yeah, we want tons of pro-ams and stuff, and then it's like, well, you want these pro-ams, but then when an amateur team is playing like Cloud9 or a low CDL team on the Delta stream, you're not watching it. So do you really want the pro-ams? And then it's like, a back and forth on that front. So um I think, it will be interesting to see how the upcoming major goes from a pro-am point of view. The big thing that we have talked about over the years recently is there's really been a couple pro-ams, and it's just like, it doesn't move the needle in terms of like these amateur teams aren't shaking up the top four championship Sunday. There's been a couple teams here and there at these pro-ams who are able to make like a top 12 run, or maybe a top 8, I think has maybe been the max for an amateur team, maybe even at EWC. I can't really remember, but outside of that, it's like, the top 8 has still been all challengers, or all CDL teams. So it's definitely interesting, and it's good in terms of shaking up the bottom of the league, but when it comes to like, the tippy top, like it's really not changing much there. So I don't know. I guess we'll see how Major 3 goes, and that'll probably, get the conversation going again on the Pro-Am front. But I did think his comment on the Delta stream was definitely worth, I agreed with that, and I thought it was a valid point. I thought obviously the financial stuff was a valid point as well. And then he said that like um the DreamHack event, this was kind of looped into the Pro-Am conversations as well, just because DreamHack has other events going on at the same time. He said essentially that like the festival feel of the DreamHack is like the North Star for the CDL, but there are realities that prevent that from happening more frequently than it does right now. And I thought that was an interesting way of looking at it too.
It goes to the heart of like, what does the CDL want to be? Do they want to be the NFL, aka the no fun league, like where it's very buttoned up, very corporate, but it's extremely popular, extremely profitable, and every league would, desire to be the NFL? Or do you want to be like esports? Really, like esports is a lot of shit talk, a lot of nerds screaming at nerds, and like pretty violent. Like obviously the gameplay is pretty violent, and it's more underground than like corporate. If that's what they want, then I'm all in. Like we talked about it before, Gears of War, the way that they frame their players as like the ultimate shit talkers, like that's what needs to come back. That's why the players should be like right next to each other, or like facing each other. That's always been like, because if you can shout across your monitor to other players, even if they can't hear you, I think it's a great way to market the CDL. I mean, the greatest moments in CDL history or pre-CDL history came from, guys standing up, maybe one Killis loss, standing up and shouting across the stage at someone. Granted, they were like in a hotel ballroom and they were like 7 feet away from each other, so maybe we won't get to that. But the point remains that like it was certainly a lot less professional and more dangerous, I would say, like in terms of like advertisers and all that. But it was also more fun, more exciting. We talked about it before too, that the Draza scrap beef has been like pretty fun to watch. Like sometimes it's like, all right, guys, like, we don't need this. Like this is a little too far. But overall, I think that it adds to the matches. It adds to the drama that needs to exist. And we need more of that. I would love to see more of a festival kind of party feel of these events than what has happened. But I don't know how much like they're actually committed to that ideal, right? Because like, can you remember any other CDL event feeling like a festival? Like, whether you attended or whether you watched it, where you're like, this is absolutely crazy. Like, I think honestly, the European events, or like specifically the British events, feel more of that because they chant more, and like it definitely seems like they're, ingesting a lot more alcohol than the normal American viewers. So like maybe that has something to do with it. But I don't get the sense that the CDL is like really pushing for that in like a substantive way. And granted, they said realities and all of that, but like, I don't see it in other ways. And I don't see them doing it in most other events. So like, I guess we'll see. But yeah, I think it's interesting. And back to the pro-am argument, like I it really isn't going to be about them shaking up the top of the CDL because that never was like a real reality for amateur teams anyway. Sometimes it happened, like again, Team Revenge, and there have been, Panda almost upset the OpTic dynasty and broke them up in one of those events. But like for the large part of Call of Duty esports history, it's been like a lot of teams making a run into the top 6 and being like, oh, that's pretty cool. Like they were able to like have this run and it changes their lives forever. They were able to beat a pro team. And I think that's kind of what we should be getting at. Like whether it is something like the way I would probably do it is because you don't want to just put the challengers teams against the top 4 CDL teams because then you're probably just going to see 4 challengers teams get slaughtered by the top CDL teams. But what if you had the top 8 CDL teams get a bye, and then you get like a play-in bracket essentially between the bottom 4 CDL teams and the 4 challengers teams, and then they play each other, and like then the losers drop down to the losers bracket, the winners get slotted into the winners bracket, and then just plays out like a normal tournament from there. I think that might be something to think about because then you get some pretty competitive matches between the bottom of the CDL and the top of challengers, and you don't basically make the challengers players like challengers teams sacrificial lambs to the top of the CDL. And I also just I agree with Daniel. I fucking hate the Delta stream. I hate Charlie. I hate Bravo. Like, and I've hated him for so many years because I don't want to have multi Twitch open. I don't want to have 2, 3, 4 streams open to watch these matches. I would like to just watch one. I would like that, like the one at a time is kind of how I want to consume CDL or the CDL or just COD in general. So any way that we can get rid of those secondary or tertiary streams, then I'm in favor of that. And I think doing it in a bracket versus a group play is probably the best way to do it because there's just no way to logistically do the group play without everybody playing at the same time. And I just don't think like that's just not how it should be, in all honesty. Like it's not the NFL, like we don't, like you might have like 9 NFL games going at once, but like people have like Sunday ticket and they're jumping around. Like we don't need that for the CDL. There's only 12 teams. So like, let's jump it down to 1 and let's figure out a way for everything to fit within a 3 to 4 day period and everybody can get their shine on the mainstream in front of or on the main stage in front of all the fans. I think that's the best way to go about the pro-ams. But it appears we might get maybe one more next year, but it does kind of scare me that he's like, yeah, 1 or 2, like, just like, is 1 kind of up in the air too? Because like sometimes they didn't have pro-ams, sometimes they'd kind of forget about that. So yeah, I hope that it is here to stay. I would love for them to be just a part of the major in general, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Should we talk about the maps? Because that's been obviously a pretty big topic of conversation over the past, I don't know, like 2 months. But so I don't even know how to really set this one up. He said that communication was not great around Clifftown and basically led to its GA. But he said that there was a committee created after Major 1 in terms of the maps, including Octane and Nameless. How it ends up where we are maybe lends to the point that like not all the CDL teams are interested in talking about some of these things, going back to your point where like they have like a feedback request and they send it to the teams and then they don't get any feedback from like some of these teams. And I think the committee obviously is former players, but like still it feels like there is a disconnect between the teams in the league. And that is what causes all of these issues, especially around Clifftown and the new maps that have come in. What did you make of the conversation, the broad conversation about maps and how the CDL is handling it?
Yeah, I thought that was probably the most interesting part of that conversation was I that was at the start, or it was, towards the beginning of the episode of the flank, so I don't remember exactly how Daniel phrased it, but that was basically the summation of it, was that there could have been better communication around Clifftown in particular, in terms of like they set up this committee with former pros, and Daniel like refused to name who was on it. Octane had to come out and say like he was a part of it, and then they were joking about like Nameless being a part of it. Um, so that's how we got to that. So it would be interesting to find out who entirely is on said committee. Um, but it sounded like, they had this committee set up. They did the test with the ranked play stuff, and then it was sort of like, it at least sounded like the players were just going to be like, nah, Clifftown sucks. We're not even going to bother playing with it. And then the league was like, well, actually, we tried to run this test in ranked play, and then the committee voted on some of these maps, and it's getting used. And then that led to this whole GA debacle. So at the end, Daniel made the point that he basically said, like, I can't remember if he was saying like him or the league in general, but it was basically like he was like, I don't really care what map is in. They just, people were talking about new maps, and we wanted to get new maps in, and that's what we did. So I think that's like kind of like, the league shouldn't really care what ABC map is in the pool. Obviously, there could be some scenarios where the league would care if there's like these historical maps that we know work out well. But obviously, there have been instances like this year where like even raid isn't used in every mode, even though we know it's, you know, one of the greatest Call of Duty maps of all time. And maybe that's an instance where the league could step in and be like, okay, we want this map in regardless of what you think. But then outside of that, you can do whatever you want with the map pool. So it will be interesting to see how this new committee um, influences the map pool going forward. Because, like I said, I think after Major 3, Clifftown will be replaced. Just after
Yeah.
this conversation, that's my feeling, especially if it's just never actually played. Outside of that, though, I would be really surprised if there are major map pool changes this year again. So then my question, or just what I want to see from all this, is, will this committee, like, is this committee going to be something that stays in perpetuity and is used from game to game now, or season to season, in game, evaluating the maps that are added mid-season, and all that. So that's mostly what I'm looking at from this going forward.
It's a good thing to have a committee like this. You know, the NFL famously has a competition committee, and they vote between seasons of like what changes. Like the tush push was nearly banned last year, or last off season, because I think it was the Packers. They submitted a proposal of like, this is anti-competitive and we need to get rid of it, and then they had a vote and everybody voted, and the league was like, no, we'll keep it in. And that's kind of how it should be. But that also really, like, the players need a large say in that. And I would love for the committee to be comprised of, or composed of, like, current players, former players. Like, I just think there needs to maybe some kind of other like third party who aren't like connected to the players necessarily. Maybe there needs to be like fan representatives or something. Like, I
I
know I
think
don't
that's
want to
where
see Scar in this for 3 times.
I think that's where the ranked play feedback comes
Yeah.
in. It sounds like it's going to be a balance of this committee, the pros, and then whatever ranked play tests they're going to be able to run.
Yeah, so I think that would be good to get fan feedback and see what they like and what they want to watch, and then get the feedback from the players and like what they want to play, what they enjoy, and then kind of coming to a decision, coming to a vote, because it seems like there again there's a disconnect between the players and team, or the players and the league, that we just get like these pretty like lukewarm changes, or if there is like a pretty explosive change like this, we're seeing Clifftown just completely GA'd, and like it's not going to be played, it's not going to be vetoed. Like the teams have pretty much decided that like they're going to take it in their own hands, which is good in a way, but also we would love to see like one of the hardpoint maps actually played. We already saw that with Blackheart last stage and all that, like where it's just like a completely ignored map, which isn't good for the community. And I think that something needs to change, and hopefully this committee and whatever form it takes will be helpful in that regard. The only other thing I think we probably should touch on real quick is just like the communication between the COD devs and like the CDL, because I thought this was more interesting things that Daniel just came out and admitted like they're not gonna fix the exposure glitch before Major
Yeah.
3, and so like that kind of elicited some groans from the flank. I was like, oh shit, like that's pretty awful. And then Daniel, to his credit, was like kind of defending the devs and was saying like how it's a lot of his like communication and not necessarily like some of these things take a long time to kind of fix. Like there might be an issue that we notice in March, but it might not be able to be fixed until like April or May. And unfortunately, that's just like the reality of it. I respect his ability to defend them. I don't think that the COD devs need defended as much as they get defended. But what did you think of this whole conversation?
I will agree with you on this. I think there was never a world where Daniel was just gonna come out and say like, yeah, f the COD devs, they suck, they're terrible to work with, blah blah blah. Like that was never obviously gonna happen. Um, he said that they have multiple weekly meetings with different parts of each studio, and I just found that incredibly hard to believe because like some of these studios have no involvement in the current game right now, so like there's no way they are meeting with the CDL. Uh, obviously Treyarch is doing most of this stuff right now. There, I would find it incredibly hard to believe that they have multiple weekly meetings with Infinity Ward and Raven about maybe Raven is involved with some of the Warzone stuff, so maybe that's a little more believable. But my point being, I think it's crazy in like an other year. Maybe with Treyarch it would make sense just because Treyarch has shown the willingness to be invested in competitive Call of Duty more so than some of the other devs. But I just found that a little hard to believe. I hope it's true. I really do because that well, honestly I don't know if I hope it's true, because if it is true
No, you don't
and
hope it's true.
there is seemingly this disconnect between competitive Call of Duty and they are having all these meetings and stuff, that's not a great sign. But I don't know. I think, like I said, there was never a world where Daniel was just going to come out and blast the COD devs and say, yeah, there's no communication, anything like that. Um, but I mean, obviously good on him for defending them, and it is, if that is the case where they're having all these meetings and stuff, I guess that is a little bit of an eyebrow raiser and interesting to see if that gets us anywhere.
I honestly don't doubt that they have a bunch of those meetings. I just think that that's a corporate thing, that's like just a requirement that they have to show up and just BS a little bit. Like there's just no way that you can like it's we've been in those kind of meetings where it's like, do we need a daily meeting for this? No, we don't. Like this is kind of ridiculous. Like just send me a Slack message and like let's move on, that kind of deal. I bet it's pretty much the same thing here. Like there's just no way that you need it that frequently, with especially with the runtime that he's saying that they have. Like they can't like it's kind of like a magazine or something. Like it's not something that you can just change on a dime or whatever. Like it is like multiple weeks, maybe even multiple months in the making, and you just can't be super flexible about those things. So like yeah, whatever meetings are going on, like we obviously see that they don't lead to like really swift changes, so maybe they don't need to have those meetings. But I mean that's just a larger corporate issue. And I think we just round out on Formal's analysis of the proceedings here, because I thought this was a pretty good way to sum it up. He was on his stream and he said, I think Daniel Tsay was one of the most PR trained people I've ever seen. He answered weirdly. It's cool he came on and did it. I don't think anything concluded from it. There was zero answer for anything asked. I would agree with like 98% of that. Like no shade to Daniel, like that's his job. He's a corporate guy. Like if you have an interview with Roger Goodell, he's probably not going to say like Adam Silver is probably the best way to answer this because Adam Silver also purports himself to be like a man of the people and a man of change, and to some extent is, but also like he's corporate and he's defending the best interest of the league, not necessarily the community as a whole or the fans or the players. So like he has a very special interest in like what he's actually defending and what he's actually trying to accomplish here. And yeah, Daniel, like I don't know if he came off worse than like what people had perceived him to be. I don't really know exactly how people perceived him to be other than like aloof or like hands off essentially. So I don't know how that kind of changes his reputation. But like I agree with Formal that a lot of those answers were kind of nothing. Like, you know, they're pretty much just like a lot of words, but like very little substance behind them. And I would, my last thing I'll say before I turn it over to you is I would just suggest to the flank and whoever interviews Daniel in the future, please run your questions by someone who like asks questions for a living and like and get follow-up questions from those people because there some of them were like good questions that they asked and then he would give an answer and then they'd kind of move on from it or they wouldn't like really dial in on what he was saying, but the follow-up questions are sometimes more important than the initial question. And I think there could have been some really revelatory comments if those those um those follow-ups were made and like really pointed, because I feel like he was on the verge of saying things at times but then like remembered what he was supposed to be doing, so he dialed it back a little bit. But that's kind of what I hope in the future is like if he does more of these interviews, I would like to see people push him a little more and try to get more out of him than just like the surface level of like, you know, we've had discussions about this, like okay, like what have the discussions generated, like how close are you, is this something that could happen in the next 3 months, the next 6 months, next year, like what is happening on a day-to-day basis rather than just kind of like the very general surface level stuff. Any concluding thoughts on what Daniel said and the conversation around it?
I think at the end of the day, kind of like I was saying with that COD dev talk at the end there, like they're you have to keep in mind, like you mentioned, who's being interviewed and what they do for their job and everything like that, and also like you just have to have some common sense with some of these stuff. Like obviously you can ask them questions that you want the answer to, like, you know, is the grand finals going to be changed, and what's the why are the COD devs seemingly not like all this stuff you can ask, but you have to be realistic about it too, and you got to realize, like, even if there is seemingly an answer to some of these that you want to hear, he's not going to come out and just say these things. Like I said, with the with the COD devs, like there was never a world where he's just gonna be like, yeah, COD devs suck. Like we're not doing that. And there was never a world where he's coming onto the flank and being like, yeah, current grand finals format sucks. We gotta change this up right now. All this shit, and like you know, you have to temper your expectations a little bit for an interview like that. I wouldn't say. I would push back a little bit in terms of saying that we didn't get anything out of this. I'm not going to say we got any major revelations or anything like that, but I did think there was some good conversations, and I thought there were some points made, and obviously there was enough for us to. They talked on the flank for 2 hours, and we're talking about it now for an hour and a half, and I think that's the bigger takeaway from all this is it's got the people talking, and hopefully just some positive things come from it in the end.
Yeah, and hopefully he continues to do stuff like this. I know that it was probably a few years now ago that he was like, we're going to be more like interactive with the community. And then they did those like, what were like the 15-minute like videos with him and Spencer and all that. Like, yeah, that's all cool. But like, I think the big things that can be answered and like the discussions really come from like an interview like this, like where people actually get to talk to him, not like him talking to people, right? Like being in a discussion rather than, you know, watching a 10-minute video where they're kind of glazing the CDL essentially. Like they're not really giving any like deep insight into like what's going on or like kind of the challenges that they might face. So yeah, hopefully he does more of these and we can get more regular comments from Daniel because I appreciate these. Like, you know, I obviously like lambasted him for a few of these things and I will continue to do so. But like, you know, I appreciate him putting himself out there and like actually opening himself up to being lambasted versus like kind of cowering in a corner and being like, oh, I don't want to talk to people. I don't want to, you know, have to answer questions on stream or whatever. So we will see if anything comes of that. We do have to shift gears real quick and talk about the second week of the Major 3 qualifiers. They start on Friday. So we had 1 week, 2 weeks ago, and then we had the minor last weekend, and now we're back to the qualifiers this weekend, starting on Friday, May 1st. OpTic versus Boston to begin the proceedings. I believe both of us are going to go with OpTic on this one.
Yeah, gotta go with OpTic.
Same with LAT versus C9. LAT coming off of their minor 1 victory. C9 coming off of another loss. Going to go with the Thieves here.
Yep, give me LAT.
And then FaZe versus Carolina. I think we're both going to go with FaZe. Granted, FaZe did not look nearly at their best last weekend, but Carolina also did not look at their best, so I'll go with FaZe.
I'll go with phase 2. I will say I think this is probably the best opportunity for us to have the non-winning team win a map on Friday. If Carolina doesn't win a map, though, I have a feeling Friday might be a 9-map day.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. Like, I don't know why they scheduled it like that. That's just crazy.
I'll throw this out to you. Do you think it's more likely that Carolina or Boston win any map, or C9 wins the search against LAT?
I think it's more likely that C9 wins the S&D.
I do too, and that's a pretty crazy thing to say.
Like I honestly think C9 will lose 3-1, but I'm pretty confident Carolina and Boston are getting 3-0. And then Saturday, May 2nd, Carolina versus C9. I mean, one of these teams has to win, so I'll go with Carolina.
Yeah. I came really close to putting Cloud9 here, but I can't bring myself to do it. If Cloud9 wins this series, it'll have to be a 3-2, and they have to win both searches, but they also means they have to win one of the respawns, and I just don't know if they can do it, so I'll go with Carolina reluctantly.
And then the most interesting match, or at least to this point, Miami versus FaZe, a rematch from last weekend. Miami,
all 3 of these next matches are rematches from the minor.
So Miami won in the semifinals of the minor to get to the finals. They beat FaZe, and I'm going to pick FaZe just to be clear, but this is like a pretty good step for Miami. Like if they can win this match, it goes a long way, honestly, to making me think that it wasn't just one weekend. It might be something that they've actually turned a corner and they're able to do this more consistently.
Yeah, I'm going to pick FaZe as well. I think this is a case. We obviously have the sample of Miami just recently beating them online. So I wouldn't fault anybody for picking Miami here, but I still think FaZe is the better team. And if Miami wins this, then we can have, a bigger conversation around, is like Miami the new G2 for FaZe or something like that. I don't really know, but I'll take FaZe here.
Vancouver versus Falcons up next. I'll go with Falcons, but I could actually see Vancouver winning this, of course. Falcons did beat the Surge last weekend, so maybe that's something to keep in mind.
I picked Vancouver last weekend for the minor, and they let me down. They really, they almost blew a 100-point lead in the only map they won, and then after that, Falcons won the rest of the map. So seems like, it really, like, based on the talent and the names on both of these rosters, it shouldn't even be a match that we really have to discuss much about, but that's just the state of both of these teams right now. So I'll take Falcons, but I did pick Vancouver, before, so I wouldn't be necessarily surprised if Vancouver pulled this off, but that would just be my luck if I pick Vancouver when they lose and then pick Falcons when they lose.
And then a rematch of the quarterfinals to round out Saturday, Toronto versus OpTic. OpTic pretty decisively won their matchup as we expected against Koi at the minor. I think it'll happen again, so I'm going to pick OpTic.
Yep, going with OpTic. I think it is cool, though, to see these three matches as rematches from the minor, and I will try to remember to look to see if there's any differences between the vetoes and whatnot between this matchup and the last one, because that would be interesting to see as well.
Then on Sunday, May 3rd, starting with Vancouver versus LAT, going to go with LAT.
Yep.
Miami versus G2. That one's pretty interesting because you mentioned if Miami beats FaZe on Saturday, they would appear to be the new G2 because G2 had a few wins against FaZe earlier in the season. That hasn't really been a good thing for G2 since then because they've been pretty hit or miss. And we talked about it quite at length on the last episode that it does seem like a roster change is probably in their near future, especially if they don't like turn around now. I'll go with Miami, obviously, because they've just looked way better recently. But I have no doubts that G2 could actually win this match.
Yeah, I'm going with Miami. I am super out on G2, but this is just another instance of when we least expect G2 to pull something off, they have a shot to beat a team that some people are getting a little high on for Miami's recent performance. Like this has G2 win written all over it, but I'm not falling for it.
And then the last match is Genomates versus Boston. I'll go Paris.
Yep, I'm going with the mates. So chalk week in the pick'ems. I would argue the only real one that I think I would maybe go the other way on you would be the Miami versus FaZe one, but I think this will be a rare instance where we have the same picks for a whole week.
Yeah, I just think like it feels like a little too far to pick Miami over FaZe. Like even if we just saw them win one match against them last week, like you just kind of have to rely that FaZe will learn from that and be like, all right, guys, like let's lock in a little bit and let's win this match. But we will see. Yeah, I think it'll be a relatively chalk week. I honestly think this is like one of the more like lopsided weeks in terms of the schedule, which just happens. I think like you're just gonna have to have some like railroads essentially, and I feel like that's just gonna be this week. But it might be like all upsets, and we're talking about on Sunday,
Yep.
just like how OpTic lost their matches and FaZe lost theirs and all that. Like, but yeah, pick them. You are 105 and 58 on the year. I'm 106 and 57. Trimmer is still winless. And that does it for us. Thank you for listening and watching. Make sure to subscribe or follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. We're also on YouTube. You can subscribe. We are, I think, 3 subscribers away from 300. So please subscribe if you're not already to the YouTube channel. You can watch the live stream of the podcast and or the VOD on YouTube. So you can go to YouTube or you can go to twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast and you can follow and subscribe and watch the live streams there. You can also follow and subscribe to Bink on Twitch, twitch.tv/JBink with 2Ks. And the Twitters are at JBink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers, and at Ego Chall Podcast. And the next show should be on Sunday, May 3rd, after the matches, and we'll break down everything and discuss if there's any kind of news that has popped up, as is tradition between Wednesday and Sunday that aren't matches. But we'll discuss it all then. And I believe that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys, as always, for all the support. Definitely a little bit of a different show from us, like basically just going over everything that Daniel and the guys on the flank had to say. So obviously shout out Zuma and shout out the flank for even giving us this opportunity to have something really to talk about. Shout out Daniel, regardless of like Preston was saying at the end of his spiel, like regardless of what you think about Daniel and the CDL, like he took the time to go on arguably the biggest show for Call of Duty esports and sit there and talk about stuff for 2 hours. It'd be very easy for other people in similar positions to just be like, no, I'm not going to do that. So, regardless of what you think of the outcomes and everything like that, at least he took the time and was willing to do that. So shout out Daniel and shout out the flank. If you guys haven't watched that episode or listened to it, I highly recommend it and take the time to hear what they had to say to yourself and then come to your own conclusions. And if you have any thoughts after that on what we thought about it or anything like that, leave in the comments and we can bring it up next episode. But yeah, should be back in the swing of things from a match perspective now for our next show, unless some crazy news drops, but who knows at this point. Outside of that, should be business as usual now, and looking forward to more matches this weekend. So thank you guys, as always, for all the support. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next one. Remember to send the chow.